Greetings, everybody. My name is Jean Bajalan, and I'm here taking over the This Is Revolution channel with Gaming Materialists, where we talk about all things game. And when I say game, I mean real games, which involve pens, paper, miniatures, toys, all kinds of tactile instruments, not video games. And yeah, today we are going to be talking about the second biggest beast. So for our first episode, we hit Dungeons and Dragons up with Dan Larson. But for this episode, we're going to be talking about the royal family of tabletop miniatures, Games Workshop. And joining me, of course, is my co-host, the host of Varn Vlog, the bad dad of the internet, Left, and the bane of Doug Lave's life, C. Derek Varn.
Hello, and yeah, the Games Workshop dominance is an interesting topic for me because I feel like it's really come to America in a big way in the last 10 years. And I kind of really like the aesthetic, even though I know it's a joke.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of Americans who have no idea that Workshop's 40K lore is not a blueprint for political power, but rather like a satire on 1980s British politics. But, it is what it is. So today we have a wonderful guest to discuss this with. A lot of the Games Workshop related YouTube channels either deal with lore. You get some good battle reports or rule people from time to time, painting guides. And then there's a whole load of channels which are just whining about Games Workshop. But the guest we have today is a really interesting YouTuber. His Discourse, and basically she's a content creator from UK, and her YouTube channel, Discourse Miniatures, focuses on customer-related issues in the tabletop game industry, and she's a frequent critic of the predatory practices of Games Workshop, as well as other big players in the market. So I'm gonna play, and she does this in a kind of entertaining way. I'm gonna play a little clip from her latest video to give you guys an idea, and then we're gonna bring her in. We're gonna talk to her about Games Workshop, about how it operates, and what does the Games Workshop sort of de facto monopoly in the tabletop gaming industry mean, which actually I think is a good thing to talk about, because this was something that Discourse talked about in her latest video. So let's get this on a little bit, and let's play a little bit here. Oh, and of course, as usual, I forget to do the sound. Shame on me. Please, one moment. I always forget this. Share sound. So, sorry about that, guys. Can you hear? Well, it looks like some of the sound system is not quite working with our system today, but the artistic quality of this should be apparent to people, and I do recommend that people check out Discourse. Oh, it's muted on YouTube. That's what it is. Shame on me. Okay, let's try this one more time.
Well, come on, people. The stock is dipping and the board are not pleased. I don't have to explain to you the meaning of the word flesh pit again, do I? No, I didn't think so. Okay, let's warp storm this. What if we take our next box set and make it some sort of limited release run? Like, say, for example, it's only available this weekend and never again. We've already done that, mistress.
Yeah, with every new release.
Damn, okay. How about we take all the fan animation on YouTube and put it behind a paywall? That way we get paid for nothing at all.
Yeah, that's basically Warhammer Plus.
Okay, well then how about we just trick YouTubers into giving us good reviews? No matter how bad it is.
Already on, Mom. Johnson, the Vile, and the Goblins down in Legal are already spearheading that development.
Well then, I'm all out of ideas. How about we just release some new Space Marines? Doing that right now, Mistress. Drat, we need something new. Something fresh. How about New Eldari?
Welcome, Discourse. Go.
Hey, everyone.
We have an applause trace to it, and also me messing up the technical videos is now kind of a common theme on our show. I've done it like 3 times now, so I should really learn from that. So I apologize for that, but yeah, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to meet you guys.
Well, the first thing I want to ask you is why do you hate Space Marines so much?
I think that even as a kid, I knew that they were kind of lame, right? Like even when I first started, I was like, "Oh, that's for all the normies. That's not for me. I'm going to be all special. I'm going to go for the witch hunters and the sisters of battle." So that's why I've always had a love-hate relationship with Space Marines. I'm sort of aware that they're the main accessible sort of model that everybody gets into, and I love that, right? Like I love that it appeals to so many people. But on the other hand, you know, I play Dark Eldar. I think we're kind of hard done by a little. Not right now, but historically we have been. Yeah. Yeah,
there's been some nice stuff out, but yeah, really the Space Marines get a lot of love, and we'll get into why that is. But yeah, I kind of think Space Marines suck. I'm more of an Imperial Guard guy, but I like humans getting murdered. But of course, Imperial Guard now has the more trademarkable name of Astra Militarum, of course.
Yeah, right. Of course. I find I just call them by their old names: Imperial Guard, Eldar, Dark Eldar. I don't really have time for these newfangled names.
These newfangled names, which are designed to be certainly copyrightable, like all the Age of Sigmar stuff is now. It's not an orc, it's an uruk and things like that. But you know, it is what it is. So I want to start a little bit before we get into talking about your channels. Like, how did you get into the hobby?
Oh, wow. So, I mean, it's kind of funny. So where I live, there is a big Games Workshop store, like right in the center of town. And since a very young age, I can always remember walking past it, you know, as a kid. So there's never been a time in my life where I haven't been in some sort of way conscious of miniature wargaming. It's always like, it's kind of like a primordial memory of mine. I've always had that in the back of my head. But it wasn't until I played Dawn of War that I actually got really into it, because that video game, that's a video game that was released in like 2004. That actually exposed me to the hobby. Like I had never played with the miniatures. I just walked past the store and seen all these cool little miniatures, but never gone much further than that. So it was the video game that sort of inspired me to take my first steps into it. And I was hooked. I was immediately hooked. I fell in love with it. And then I got into the sort of Games Workshop ecosystem, because that's what they like to do. You get into the store and then you're into Warhammer. You're not into miniatures, you're into Warhammer, because that's their business model. So I've been into Warhammer for a very long time, for about 17 years now at this stage. But I would say that I've only really gotten into miniatures as a whole, as a sort of expansive hobby, in a much shorter time frame, you know, because really, I mean, can you really say you're completely into miniature wargaming if you've only ever played like 40K and Warhammer Fantasy? You know,
very true. Yeah, I mean that's interesting. I mean, like, I completely agree with you about the profile of Games Workshop in towns in the UK. This doesn't really exist in the United States for a myriad of reasons, including the way that the American cities don't have town, right? They don't have a town where you go to town. But yeah, I remember as a kid walking past Games Workshop in my hometown, seeing it every day, and it became a very big sort of place where I still have friends that I met in Games Workshop in the 90s. I got into Warhammer basically exactly around the time the first Warhammer Fantasy box set came out. The one with the High Elves and the Goblins, which I got for Christmas, and then I got a Citadel paint set, and that was I was in and out of the hobby years. Man, I was like at high school, but yeah. So Games Workshop really has this like high profile thing, but I think you make an important distinction, is that Games Workshop is its own ecosystem, but there is a bigger hobby out there, and a lot of people don't even realize that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say that even at school we had Warhammer Club. We didn't have sort of. I mean, you see this in other hobbies. You see it in tabletop role playing with D&D, right? Everyone's like, I'm into Dungeons and Dragons, and at this stage, I don't play Dungeons and Dragons, but I play other tabletop games. But I have to tell, if people ask me like, what are you into? I just say D&D because it's part of the sort of discourse now where you have to say that, otherwise they don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I'm into obscure White Wolf games of the 90s. You can't really say stuff like that. And the same thing I think is true to some extent with miniature wargaming, but it's not as true. And I think there's a capacity to say that I'm into miniatures, and people will still understand sort of what you're talking about, because you could be talking about historicals, or you could be talking about all sorts of different games. So Warhammer hasn't completely dominated it, but it's not for lack of trying. Like, they really do want you to get into their ecosystem, and they want you to buy their paints and their paintbrushes and their models and their glue and every single aspect of the hobby. They want you to buy Games Workshop branded materials. And even in all their marketing, they call it the Warhammer hobby. So they're trying to make this the sort of normative experience. But they haven't 100% succeeded, but there is a lot of people who have never played any game outside of Warhammer and wouldn't even know that there are any.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very cartelistic model of capitalism that Games Workshop is going for, and it's extremely aggressive. So one thing I actually kind of wanted to ask you, sort of, kind of like on your observation, is, since you started in the miniature war games hobby, how has it changed? How do you think it's changed? Because I get the feeling that, like, Warhammer was massive. I mean, I don't know how old you are, but I'm assuming you're like maybe 10 years younger than me. So in the 90s, it was very widespread, but it was kind of underground. Like, everybody at school knew what Warhammer was because there was a Games Workshop shop in town. There was all the nerds playing Warhammer. Even some of the cool kids, maybe they got some Warhammer, but it never had any kind of like mainstream purchase.
And in the States during that time period, it had none at all.
Yeah, it was very underground in the States, right? What would you say, Vaughn, about its profile in America in the 90s?
Well, I mean, one, it's expensive as it is, but also if you think about 90s exchange rates, it would have been prohibitively expensive for a high schooler in the U.S. And Games Workshop never really established a cartel model here. So yeah, you could find Warhammer miniatures in almost every hobby store, but kids didn't play it. It was very much a middle age phenomenon when I was younger, up until Dawn of War came out. I think that game really did change its perception in the American market. And so when I hear people talk about Warhammer and the Isles, I'm like, oh, it's like, because here, when it was the most dominant in the UK, it was like 5 rows back in the US. It was just not. It was a prohibitively expensive game that you saw 40-year-old nerds play.
And I would note, I did work for Games Workshop. I worked in the I was one of the proles in the shop. I worked in the Oxford Street, London Plaza shop before they moved it to, I think they moved it to Tottenham Court. But anyway, it was like a big money turnover shop. And I do remember, like, they didn't really have Games Workshops in America. So like Americans would come in like Vaughn says, like 40, 50. It's like, oh my God, it's a Games Workshop. Hell yeah. I'm going to buy me some Games Workshop miniatures. So this was the kind of thing. But I think Dawn of War's really changed it. So what's your perception of the changing view of the hobby over the years, especially while you've been in it?
Well, that's super interesting, because I think I came in with that wave then of people who were sort of introduced via Dawn of War, because I suppose I have some experience of before that being aware of it, and people at school were aware of it, and there was like a Warhammer club at school, but it wasn't until Dawn of War that I got into it amongst some other friends as well. But even for me at that time, I mean, it was pretty prohibitively expensive as well. So I had to sort of get into it in a very lukewarm fashion. I started off with Sisters of Battle and then quickly moved on to Guard. So I was like you, I went into the Imperial Guard. I preferred the people dying to be human. Thank you very much. But in terms of change, wow, I mean, it's a big time period between 2004 and now. A lot has changed. I think one of the things to remember about the sort of the hobby is that there's probably about 3 or 4 different hobbies rolled into one. So there's painting, there's assembling, there's the wargaming side of things where you actually play the game. There's the collecting aspect as well, which is actually a very big thing for a lot of people. And now you have 3D printing, which is an entirely, new aspect of the hobby. That's a huge aspect on its own. So there's a lot of changes, I think. In terms of painting, I think the rise of contrast paints has been really big for accessibility. There's a lot of people I know who maybe had issues with painting, be that sort of just with their skill, such as myself, or with other reasons that they weren't able to paint very well. Then contrasts, I think, have opened the doors for a lot of people. I've spoken to a lot of people who have said that. In terms of the sort of gaming aspect, I think a lot has changed, but nothing real fundamental. I think in terms of the gaming side of things, now we're just kind of focused on Warhammer here. But in terms of the miniature wargaming as a whole, I would say that awareness of different games has increased, maybe not to the extent that I would want, but definitely I think with the rise of the internet, the rise of sort of communities online, and as people have learned about Warhammer, because Dawn of War was big, but now you have things like Total War Warhammer, which is sort of amplified the exposure of fantasy, which is really funny because it came out just as fantasy died. So I love that. I mean, they just weren't around to capitalize on it, but now we've got the old world coming out in 2022 or 23 or whenever to try and capitalize on that success. So I think that's a big thing. I think that the hobby has changed in a lot of ways as well, just in terms of inclusivity and accessibility, just overall. I think the hobby's gotten a lot more accessible. I don't think the prices have gotten much better. I think that's still a huge barrier to entry, just the buy-in that is necessary. But I think it has still gotten bigger. Games Workshop have done a lot of work to try and move into the American market, which has been really big. It's been brought in a lot of new people, have been exposed to the hobby, which is awesome. I'm a huge fan of that because I think that the miniature wargaming hobby is really good. But it is Games Workshop, so there's some good and there's some bad. You've got to take that with it.
That's a really important point. I think the prices are still problematic. But yeah, like I do get the sense that it's become more mainstream. I have theories for that. I think there's a lot of 90s kids who, like me, had no money in the north, but now have a kind of job and are getting back. And COVID has kind of accelerated that. So, I didn't collect games. I like Games Workshop models. I followed Games Workshop, but I didn't collect, from probably the time I left Games Workshop's employment when I had cheap miniatures, till like maybe when I moved to America, when I actually had some time and some money to collect miniatures. So I think that's part of the thing. But I think also like the demographic of the hobby is changing. I think Games Workshop, one of the positive things they've done is to like work harder to have women involved in it, because Games Workshop, I mean, the hobby was like pretty toxic in the 90s, and some of it was like overt like sexism. Some of it was just like you would have a kid who, like, we had a kid, this is a true story, who like got so excited that he shit himself in the Games Workshop and didn't leave, and we had to throw it, and you would have all this BO and this like negative kind of personal hygiene things. And I mean, when I was working for Games Workshop at Plaza, they had a woman who worked as a key timer with us, and she got harassed all the time. But I think Games Workshop I think the hobby has opened up more to women. What would you think about that?
Oh, 100%. I think without a doubt, it really has. I can, I've sort of watched it make those changes slowly. I think the Games Workshop, I think to their credit, Games Workshop have been very good at that side of things. I think it's because they perceive themselves as a very corporate, professional entity, that they, are keeping more in step with the sort of these more liberal values in a lot of ways, because they're aware that there's a huge portion of the market that they have no traction with right now. And so if they can, it might be a little bit of a cynical reading, but I think it's a truthful one, and I think that's good, right? I think that this accessibility is awesome. I just wish it would translate more into some of their pricing policies.
I mean, this was actually something we discussed when we talked about Dungeons and Dragons last time. You have the reactionary elements of the fan base who, are like, why are you getting the girls in? Like, blah, blah, blah. But it's just a pure it's nothing to do with some like kind of like woke conspiracy to like, effeminize, men. It's just a logical business decision to expand your market share. And I think, that's how it should be viewed. And one other thing I kind of wanted to add is like, you said, there's more awareness of other brands. I think from my perception, I think the Star Wars games that were brought out by Fantasy Flight have been a big thing. But you also have other companies like Mantic. I'm very much into Mantic games these days. They really picked up the slack when Fantasy was gotten rid of with Kings of War, and their pricing model is a lot better. I play actually the Warpath. They have a game called Dead Zone, which is kind of their equivalent of Kill Team, but it's actually a lot better than Kill Team. And so, I think they do a good job. And I like Warlord games, they've really done a lot to popularize historicals, which is like Bolt Action is crazy popular in America. People are playing Bolt Action all the time. So I think that's a really interesting aspect, because there was very much, again, back in my hometown, there was a Games Workshop, but then there was a crusty old gaming club. We're going to replay the Ottoman Greek War of 1897, and we're going to do the battle. It's like, okay, cool. But now that's kind of like changed up because the rule things. So I kind of want to get onto the juice then of what you talk about. It's like your channel is critical of Games Workshop, right? You're not a Games Workshop hater. You're not one of these. I don't know what the guy's called, but there's one guy who just every video is him whining about Games Workshop, with no meaning, right? But you actually have very concrete and well-researched critiques of Games Workshop. So could you outline what you see, perhaps briefly, as the fundamental problems with the way that Games Workshop operates? And do you kind of think this is inevitable? This is a capitalist profit maximization is the name of the game. Is Games Workshop just inevitably going to behave like this? So kind of a big one, but
very big. I think it's a really interesting question. So just to quickly get out of the way, I think that Games Workshop, in terms of their business practices, I think they practice a lot of things that you might see in other marketplaces, but I think that they take it a little bit to the extreme. And I think the context that this all operates in is really important, but I'll get to that in a second. So in terms of the sort of business practices themselves, they really like to exploit FOMO, or the fear of missing out, which is basically this idea of exclusivity. This is your opportunity to purchase this box set or this model, and that's it. Once this time period, this window expires, you'll never have that opportunity again. And that sort of preys on, there's a lot of people who like to collect things in the hobby. There's a lot of people who like to have things for their army, and unfortunately this kind of element really does prey on that desire. There's also a lot of typically value saving in some way in terms of these sort of FOMO practices. So a lot of people, I think, get pressured into buying them because they're saving money now, but not kind of realizing that they're probably spending money that they wouldn't have spent in the first place. So it doesn't actually save them money, right? And that's why Games Workshop love it so much. And that's a big problem with Warhammer, is that it is very cost prohibitive. It's a very expensive hobby, especially with the amount of products the Games Workshop are churning out. They churn out quite a lot. And so if you have a big box set every quarter, that gets very expensive very, very quickly. And you still have to make the decision as to whether or not to buy in a weekend. You don't have very many time at all. You don't have very much lead up time. You're just kind of vaguely aware. And then you get the pricing and the box set, make your decision. It's Friday. That's it. And that is a huge problem because that exploits a lot of a lot of people who suffer from certain compulsions and conditions, and it's a big issue. And it also affects sort of veteran hobbyists, I find, as well. I know a lot of people who have just dropped out of the miniature wargaming hobby entirely because they can't keep up. But it's more than that. They hate feeling like they have to keep up because that's all the marketing is all about. This is the latest and greatest. You have to get this. And then as soon as that's done, it's on to the next one and on to the next one and it's this treadmill. You're just kept on this treadmill, constantly waiting. So in a lot of ways, it feels like a Skinner box, but instead of pressing the button, you've got to hand over lots and lots of money. And, it's maybe not as easy to buy, or you don't get as much opportunities to buy something like, say, a loot box in a video game, but it costs a lot more. Like, proportionally, it costs a lot more. So that's really tough. And that combines with the fact that this hobby is really a lifestyle hobby in a lot of ways. So it takes a lot of time to get through these products. So you end up just with boxes and boxes and boxes, and people refer to this as their pile of shame. And that's a big problem because then it feels like this huge weight on your shoulders of products that you've purchased, and you're still buying more, but you're not getting through the ones you have. And it's just destructive. It doesn't help anybody except for Games Workshop, of course. So that is I think that's one of the major ones. And it's one of the ones that you'll see people talk about a lot. They feel FOMO, but it's often justified in this sort of couched in this kind of discourse of, well, it's a business. They need to market in some capacity. They need to sell these products. But my response to that has always been, well, look at all the other businesses in this space, right? There's a lot of miniature war games who don't prey on FOMO. Loads of them, in fact. You don't necessarily need to sell these big bundled boxes for a limited time period. I understand that storage is an issue, and made to order does cause production issues, but there's lots of companies who manage that, and they manage it really well. And they design their business model around this revolutionary concept of, we're going to make miniatures and then we're going to sell them to you for a reasonable price. And that's their business model.
Like who would you put in that category?
Blackside Studios are really good. I really like. I'm a big proponent of Blackside Studios. Now, they are American and they mostly sell in America. They've got issues with shipping right now, but they are a really strong company for that. They don't even engage in Kickstarter because they feel like that is too much of a sort of limited time offer. They don't really like that model. And I kind of agree with them on that, but that's a whole different thing. And so they work on that way. Warlord Games that you brought up previously, I think that Warlord Games are really good as well, and I think they offer really affordable miniatures. Perry Miniatures are really good. They've got very affordable miniatures, and they just keep a roster of miniatures that you can buy. Imagine that. And that so you've got all these companies who are currently practicing what I would call good consumer practice, okay? And they are selling their miniatures for reasonable prices. The Games Workshop don't do that. And what I'm concerned about is that they are the market leader, and they have been for a long time. But as they find success, I think that it can embolden other companies to begin to adopt those sorts of practices. And one of the examples that I always go to, because it was so stark and it really impacted myself, was video games. In the early 2000s, video games operated on this model of, we sell you a game, you give us the money. And that was a great model. And then they sold expansion packs, which was fine. It was good value for money. And then it, became DLC. And then it became day one DLC. So we've taken a portion of the game that we've made and we've put it to one side. And then it became microtransactions. So now we're selling you items inside the game, right? And there's always this steady push forward, trying to take it slightly further and slightly further. And whenever people push back, they would go, okay, sorry. Okay, we won't do that again. But then a couple of years down the line, they'd try it again, and they'd push it a little bit further this time. And they'd go back a step and then step forward twice. And that was a big issue. And now we're in 2021, where microtransactions are everywhere. Loot boxes are in every single game that you can imagine. Everything has some sort of online component. And monetization strategies have really, to me, almost ruined video games. And I'm concerned that as miniatures become more popular, because I think they're becoming more popular as they expand into all these markets, America, Asia, I'm concerned that there will be companies will be seduced into adopting some of these more predatory practices in order to gain more cash. Whether or not that's inevitable, I'm not sure. I think that with good sort of management from sort of consumer advocates, I think that can be managed to some extent. I do think there's always going to be a pressure to try and optimize profits no matter what. But I do think that there can be, especially with miniature wargaming being so niche, consumers actually have a lot of power in this marketplace. But it's often it's not utilized very well. So, for example, in August, we had calls for a boycott off the back of there was pay controversy with some Games Workshop designers. But it didn't really go anywhere because it wasn't really organized. It was just sort of this general call.
Yep.
But I think that actually, if there was some form of organization, that these sorts of things could actually make an impact on companies like Games Workshop, because Games Workshop don't have mass market appeal. They have awareness and they have lots of people playing the video games. But in terms of their miniature side of things, they don't have, it's not like you walk into someone's house and you expect to see Warhammer. You might exclaim if you do. People who play Warhammer have a lot of power in terms of how they, where they spend their money.
But I think also a problem is that Games Workshop perhaps is shifting from a model of being a miniature company to being basically an IP company.
Yeah.
That's what it seems to. That seems to be the direction the company's going, and they're doing it badly, right? Black Library was a success, which for those who don't know is the novels and things like that. But that kind of grew organically anyway. They had some really creepy novels by Ian Watson in the early 90s, and then they realized this was successful, and then they kind of went off that. They used to have Inferno, short story magazines. But I think Games Workshop is definitely overestimating and mismanaging its IP. But that is detrimental to the hobby side of the game, because then they're thinking less about the hobbyists. And I think another problem is that I think there is a element of the community who will defend Games Workshop on the most ridiculous grounds. I know people personally, if you write anything critical about Games Workshop, they're like, well, it's a luxury hobby. If you don't like it, don't play it. It's like, why are you simping for Games Workshop? You can complain about the business practices of a company, and it's well, it's a luxury hobby. It's but do you want it to be a luxury hobby? And that kind of leads me to the kind of second question is, what are the implications of these business practices on the hobby community, right? In some ways there seems to be a contradiction. And as lefty Marxists, we love our contradictions. So on one hand, Games Workshop is bringing people into the hobby. But on the other hand, it seems these business practices do not make for a good atmosphere for people to continue on with this hobby. So
yeah, I 100% agree. And I think it's these kind of conflicting objectives the Games Workshop have. So on the one hand, they want to try and expand the game as much as possible. They want as many people as humanly possible to play the game, because that means more money for them. And so long as they're coming in through the Warhammer side of the hobby, they don't really want you to be playing Bolt Action. They want you to be playing Warhammer. So that is obviously an element of it. But on the other hand, they want to exploit those hobbyists as much as possible. So they want you to come in and they want to squeeze as much money from you as possible. Now, they always commit themselves to this sort of long-term idea that they're always seeking long-term profit, not short-term. And I think to some extent that's true. They do maintain the hobby in a lot of ways, in a lot of areas. But they do practice a lot of marketing techniques as well as, FOMO, for example. Mm-hmm. That, like we mentioned earlier. Artificial scarcity by putting, miniatures in big bundled boxes and not giving you any ability to purchase them from anywhere else. And they basically want to try and monetize the pockets that they have as much as possible. Not really, basically churning. So if they're happy for some hobbyists to drop out, so long as the majority, or not even the majority, but a minority continue to spend a lot of money. So one of the interesting things that I've heard is that there's a lot less people playing miniature war games when compared to the tabletop role-playing community. Mm-hmm. There's a lot more tabletop role players, but there's a lot more money in miniatures because they're monetized more effectively. Whenever you go in to play a Warhammer game, you've got to spend at least, I would say, probably around $100 just to get started, right? Mm-hmm. You've got to buy your rulebook, you've got to buy your paints, your clippers, your box of miniatures. I mean, the miniatures are like almost a small part of the buy-in in the very first place. And that really continues with your relationship with the hobby, especially if you stay in the Games Workshop ecosystem. You're going to be presented with a lot of opportunities to spend a lot of money. And you're going to consistently, that's going to be reinforced with the FOMO element that we were speaking about earlier. And that's just going to be happening. That's just something you have to sort of, acknowledge. And if you can't hack that, then you end up getting burned out and alienated from the hobby. And that happens to lots and lots of people. And one of my big concerns is that people don't drop from Warhammer. Some do, but not often. Most people drop from miniatures. Like they can't keep up with Warhammer, so they're just like, this isn't for me. I can't keep up with all this rate of releases. I can't afford these miniatures. I'm gonna drop out. And they just stop playing altogether. But there's loads of really good miniature companies out there making good miniatures, and they're not able to sort of get the leftovers, really, the people who have just been burned out completely. And that's a big problem. So you have a lot of attrition in the hobby of people just dropping out from Warhammer. But Games Workshop don't really mind that much because they can continue to monetize the people who do spend, people who do buy these boxes every single release quarter, who collect multiple armies, dozens of different armies, and they try to keep up. The ones who are really competitive, maybe, who want to, stay on top, and so therefore they're buying the next flavor of the month army. Those are the ones that Games Workshop are happy to continue serving up to. And they want more people to come in so they can find more players like that, or they can convert you from someone who would be happy just to buy a single army or just a miniature every so often, and convert you into someone who wants to buy absolutely everything, who loves the IP completely and has to have everything. And that's what all their marketing is designed to do, in my opinion. I think, especially online. I don't think as much in the stores. I think the stores are all about outreach, about getting new people in. But then I think once you're there and you're in the marketing material, then it's all about getting you to buy big.
So one thing
Oh, Derek, your sound is cut. There we go. I think I hear you again. Can you hear us, Derek? Nope. Oh, wait. I think you're back. No?
Nope.
Oh. Well, okay. I'll ask the next question, and then Derek,
Sure.
Hopefully we'll get your sound back.
Sure.
So you talked about the community. How the IP is in Games Workshop, and especially the kind of weird metamorphosis of the IP from like something that was kind of a joke in the 1980s to something that is like super serious. But also the weird thing is that most of the Black Library and sort of lore developers are like actually uber liberal, but they're kind of promoting like a semi-fascist message.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, I think the IP is really, really important to the hobby. And I think it is the most important thing to Games Workshop. In all their internal documents, all their material, all their reports, they always refer to the IP as their most, profitable or their most valuable asset that they have. And I think they are, to some extent, correct in that. It's why I think Star Wars Legion has also been a good gateway into the hobby, because it has a really big, strong IP that people recognize. So I think that's definitely a huge element to Games Workshop. The fact that they've been able to get it into people's sort of video games and in the books, as you said, the Black Library was really good. It was very organic, like you said, has been a huge boon for them, and has definitely contributed, I think, to the majority of their success. In terms of the change in that IP, yeah. So I do miss the 80s version of Warhammer. It wasn't something that I directly experienced. I got into the game in 2004. So even at that stage, things had gotten sort of super serious in a lot of ways. The sort of satirical elements had begun to be lost. They weren't all gone. They weren't as different as they are now. And what I find is that actually, as the sort of lifespan of the game has gone on, I've grown less interested in the IP side of things, just on a personal level, until I played Necromunda. Actually, I think Necromunda, the 2017 re-release of that, has managed to sort of maintain some of those satirical elements. I think it's one of the few sections of the IP that maybe speak a little bit to the truth of what it would actually be like to live in the Imperium. Probably not that great, not a very functional system. Everything is pretty awful, actually. And it's those satirical elements that have kind of been lost. I think to some extent that's always going to be inevitable if you create your main protagonist faction as a member of that sort of very problematic government system, who also are hyper competent and never fail and are always, that sort of version of the Space Marines I've never been a fan of.
Yeah.
But it's sort of inevitable. I do think that if you're going to do it that way, I think that there's a lot of people who obviously know that the system isn't meant to be. I mean, everyone knows that Grim Dark isn't really meant to be taken that seriously, that it's not meant to be a competent system. But I think there's a huge proportion of people who are wistful for that sort of world.
Yeah.
And they have always sort of been there. I think there's always people who won't get it, right? There's always people who just won't get it because that's an entirely different side of things.
That's true. So, Vaughn, is your sound back? Can you hear us?
Yes.
So, go ahead. Sorry, with your question.
Actually, this actually still relates. I've been thinking about the differences in the way IP is handled with Games Workshop and like actually almost any other part of the larger hobby gaming communities. But if you contrast Games Workshop practices to, say, Wizards of the Coast Hasbro practices, the FOMO is not as intense. You're right, is not as highly marketized, but Hasbro has been very good at maintaining IP, but they're nowhere near as litigious or as cartelized or monopolizing the way Games Workshop is. I mean, infamously in America, Games Workshop sort of botched its ability to enter the country early because this is kind of known now, but the StarCraft game was clearly supposed to be a 40K game, and there was some IP fallout over control issues, and they basically lost one of the most popular games in U.S. and Asian history. Why are they like that, do you think? Why are they that controlling of the IP? I understand that this is a primary asset right now, but it also seems like they handle it in a way that builds bad blood and also doesn't work as well in foreign markets outside of the UK.
I totally agree with you. I don't think that they need to handle it this way, but I feel like it has, since the 90s, I think it has been a sort of element of the DNA of Games Workshop that they are highly litigious. I'm not actually 100% sure why they do act that way. I think it's insecurity. So in terms of their IP itself, I mean, it's obviously a hodgepodge of various different sort of, IPs that have come before it, which is fine, right? I mean, it's based a lot of its stuff on Dune. That's okay. I mean, there's nothing original anymore. But
right.
But they like to stamp on anybody who uses the term Space Marine, or at least they like to try to. They don't succeed anymore. But they are very highly litigious, and I think it's to some extent it's because they're smaller maybe than Hasbro, that they feel a lot less secure. That if they were to lose this IP in some extent, or if there's going to be someone sort of copying their designs, then they would, in a lot of ways, would feel very threatened by that and wouldn't be able to maybe weather it as well as like Hasbro would. They also don't, I mean, as far as I'm aware, they tend not to acquire other IPs either. They tend to like to focus on their own sort of in-house stuff. Warhammer 40K, they've got Gorka Morka, Necromunda. They make games that are spin-offs of their sort of central IPs. And so they make themselves very vulnerable if there is, if someone comes out tomorrow and we're the better Space Marine game. Well, then Games Workshop is going to be in a pretty poor position, and so they're very suspicious of anybody who tries to sort of do anything with their IP or who are perceived as threatening their sort of dominance with the IP, because they think it's their main thing. You got to remember, Games Workshop don't perceive themselves as a retailer; they're a manufacturer. At least in their own opinion. I disagree with them quite a lot, but they believe themselves as a manufacturer, and they're a manufacturer of Warhammer 40K miniatures and now Age of Sigmar. And so if someone else comes around and tries to do something with those 40K, then to them, that they find that very, very threatening. Would be my reading of it.
Mm-hmm. Follow up, Vaughn?
Yeah, it does seem like there is... if you compare early tabletop gaming TSR was similar in the 80s, but it actually led to a death spiral for TSR, and Games Workshop has weathered it. But I mean, they're almost, people who follow them in America are almost just surprised at how many times they've screwed up because of their fear of working with other people. And it's also interesting in that you're right. It's a very, Games Workshop locks you into so many peripheries, and that's another interesting contrast to the way, say, D&D worked. Like D&D also in the 80s tried to like lock people into their own miniatures themselves. Although early on they had second parties develop and manufacture them, and that was a disaster for them, actually. And miniatures in the United States is still, I think, after Games Workshop is associated kind of with as a periphery to D&D and to specifically D&D, not just tabletop gaming. Like, it's a D&D thing. And but that's done all by like having a very open like relationship with people being able to do manufacturing. I find it interesting because that really closed off model seems to be a problem when they can't have their own shops in other countries, which the Games Workshop shop seems to be a UK only phenomenon, even though now with the IP expansion, like, people love Warhammer all over the world. So do you think that's likely to change? And I also think, why would other companies copy that? Actually, particularly if they're interested in being in multiple countries.
Well, I think, well, first of all, there are Warhammer stores obviously in America and now in Asia as well, but I think it's 55% of their sales go through independent stores. So they do work a lot with independent stores. They do, they have to network with other stores. And I think that as they grow more successful, I don't think we'll see any change in the litigious nature. Because, I mean, already we've seen a lot of their success has come off the back of sharing their IP with other companies. There was a time there, I mean, 2004 was Dawn of War, but then they were very, very selective with who they would give their IP with to make video games out of. And it wasn't until the success, like the absolute runaway success with Total War Warhammer, that they started to really open themselves up to the marketplace and started just handing their IP out to everybody, any mobile game maker, you betcha, like they would hand it away. But for a long time there, for about 15 years, they were very, very selective. In fact, in a lot of ways, I kind of wish they would go back a little bit to that time. I think there's way too many Warhammer games.
And bad Warhammer games. They're
bad ones. And it's actually diluting their IP in the video game market, I think. I think it's actually putting some people off.
Yeah, I think when people see a new Warhammer game coming out, they're like, it's probably going to be crap. Like, because you've been burnt so many times. I mean, there were some good ones that come out. Like, I like the Battlefield Gothic games. I thought they were quite good. But, like, yeah, in general, it's like they're kind of like just trashy throwaway games with very poor production values.
Particularly on cell phones.
Oh,
yes.
God. Well, cell phones are the bane of
the amount of Games Workshop cell phone games that are terrible and it's ubiquitous, actually. Like, it's probably way more how people encounter Warcraft. Not Warcraft, Warhammer now. And I think I mean, yeah, when you compare that to Dawn of War, it seems like a huge mistake. So I guess that actually cuts in the other direction. But I'm also thinking about the miniatures element of it. I'm actually trying to figure out how many Games Workshops stores there are in the U.S. because I'd never seen one.
Well, it's the reason you don't see them is because of the geography of American cities. Like, America is made up of strip malls, so unless you know which strip mall to go to find the Games Workshop, because there's one in St. Louis, for example, you don't run into it. Whereas in the UK, where you still have like town centers as thriving commercial, well, I don't know if they're thriving anymore, but they were at least at some point thriving commercial centers. Games Workshop was very high profile because you go to the center of the city and you see a Games Workshop. You go to St. Louis, you have to like drive to a massive, like a out of town. They have one in St. Louis and they have one in Kansas City. So that's 2 in Missouri. And so you have to drive specifically to find the Games Workshop. Whereas in the UK, you could, and this to a certain extent is true in Europe as well. You could run into a Games Workshop in Venice, right? When you're like walking around, or in Amsterdam. But in America, the way that commercial zoning operates makes it a little bit different from the UK situation. That would be my take on it anyway.
I'm looking at it right here. I think it just confirms that. In Utah, for example, there are 3 Games Workshop stores. I've never seen any of them. And they're not actually in major thoroughfares. They're like, looking at it, they're tucked away in like in suburban areas and strip malls. And if you look at where you can buy, which I just did, where you could buy Games Workshop materials, the larger places are going to be independent resellers, which are actually, they tend to be in places that are more accessible. Just looking at the map right now, and I couldn't explain to you why that is. It's just I think that confirms your suspicions, Gene. But apparently it's not really working for them because, like I said, I live in this area and I've never seen a Games Workshop store, and you don't have this experience of like, oh, we walked into a Games Workshop store and now I'm locked in. Even though they're not even called Games Workshop stores, they're called Warhammer.
They're called Warhammer in America.
Yeah.
They have and also like the consumer base is kind of interesting. Like the Warhammer 40K players in the US, it's like a very like right-wing orientated hobby as well. It's lots of military veterans are involved in it. Like I was playing against a guy who all his Space Marine dreadnoughts were named after his friends who got killed in Afghanistan, and I was like, bro, like it's kind of like a bit grim. That's a bit too grim dark. That's a bit too grim dark for me. But like I think there's like a lot of I think a lot of military veterans play. It's kind of an interesting. It's like an interesting, because in Britain it's nerds. Like I guess. And nerds,
a lot of military veterans are nerds. They're just right-wing nerds.
They're just right-wing nerds. That's true. Like they're all into, what do they call them? The people who like weebs? Is that the approach? A lot of weebs in the U.S. military. A lot of weebs in the U.S. military. But yeah, I think.
The funny thing is, just to go on that point about Games Workshop stores, probably the reason why they're not in areas that maybe do get a lot of walk-in traffic these days is probably because they don't really need to be anymore. In the early 2000s, they had to be sort of in those areas in order to attract new hobbyists into them. But these days, I mean, people are Googling Warhammer, and then they're going to find out where the nearest store is. So it could be an element of that. I think. I do think that the outreach into video games has really helped them, and I think it has brought them into the mainstream. I think they've also benefited, generally speaking, from the increase in like D&D. Stuff like that. I think that they've kind of benefited from that sort of increase in sort of nerdy stuff, whether or not that's people who were growing up in the 90s getting into things again, but it's popular again, and I think that they've definitely benefited from that.
Yeah, I think like the way that, I mean, this is why some of the policies of Games Workshop, for example, their clamp down on YouTube creators, or at least the chilling effect that their new IP policies have had on YouTube creators, is actually probably counterproductive, because this is how all the kids are like learning about Warhammer. They find out about Warhammer and then they like mainline 20-30 lore videos or a fan animation and things like that. So I think there's definitely bizarre contradictions in Games Workshop practices. Well, so as we're sort of heading towards the end of our conversation today, there's actually one really important question I kind of wanted to ask you, which is about the interplay between Games Workshop's business practices, its political economy, and the development of the actual rule systems and the way that the game plays. Because I think people think, this is my kind of take, I think people tend to think like there's Games Workshop business practice and then there's game designing, and those two things are like separate things. But I think Games Workshop, for example, I would say is very conservative when it comes to rule development. So like games by Mantic or Warlord, they have much better rule systems because they've taken on the game design of the last 30 years. Whereas Games Workshop, although they modernize their rules to a certain extent, they have to keep, like, we got to have weapon skill, we've got to have 6-sided dice, we've got to have all those things. So on one hand, like, there's the dead weight of the tradition on Games Workshop. But also at the same time, I think their business and their business practices also impact on, like, game balance, or like what they're going to do for which units are going to be the best and things like that. What's your take on that?
I agree 100%. And to a large extent, this has always been an issue with Games Workshop. I mean, in 2009, Rick Priestley, who was the original creator of 40K, the rules, he left Games Workshop because, in his words, that they were not innovating anymore, that they wanted to focus on sales of the game as opposed to innovating in the product. And I do think that they have a lot of legacy systems that they don't really necessarily need anymore, or could be dropped in some ways. And it's a big issue, actually, in terms of their playability. And it's one of the reasons why I ended up playing a lot more different miniature war games, because I just got sick of the Games Workshop design. I always knew what there was going to be, three 1d6 rolls, each individual ones, and there's only going to be like a 1 in 6 chance that I'm going to fail at every roll, and it's going to be a you go, I go sort of system. And these are all because I think the Games Workshop do not want to alienate their core audience. They're terrified of that idea, because if that happens, then people will stop buying the miniatures, and so they want to do they don't want to take risks in terms of the systems. Now, that said, they brought out Kill Team. I think that was, and that has changed. That's actually had some innovations, most notably alternating activations. I'm a big fan of. They've had some, they brought in some token systems. I think that's actually been done to compete with the rise of sort of skirmish level games that we've seen in the marketplace. I think that they understand that they need to be a little bit more competitive in that area, and they can't just rely on, because they've already got Necromunda, so they had to sort of do something a little bit different with it. So that extent, that's fine. But I think overall, in terms of the mainline systems, Warhammer 40k, I think people are very fatalist in how that game is run. I think that people have just kind of resigned themselves to the idea that there's always going to be power creep of some kind, that there's always going to be this sort of treadmill of, okay, now it's time for the Space Marines to get their codex, so they're going to be really powerful for a while, and then it'll be time for the Eldar, LOL, to get their codex, and then they're going to be really maybe next year, there's rumors, we'll see.
Inshallah.
Then they're going to be really powerful for a while, and that's just going to be the way it is forevermore. That's going to be the way, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. We've seen it in the game before. I think at the launch of 8th edition, they brought out books for every single faction. They brought out these army books where every single faction was updated at the same time, and the game was probably at the most balanced it's ever been in its entire history. And that was because they did make some big changes to the system, so they wanted to bring everybody up. But then immediately they just started bringing out supplements again, and the imbalance just crept in because they wanted to sell books, and that's a big problem. And like you say, it's sort of related directly to how they make the game profitable. They sell rules, they sell FAQs, so in some ways they're sort of incentivized to get things wrong. They sell tournament edition books so that you can find out all the latest FAQs, and you get some other stuff. And all of these things, of course, they make an impact on the design. Rick Priestley told us that. So we already know that's the case. But in some ways, this is kind of good. It's bad for people who really enjoy Warhammer and want to enjoy Warhammer and want to continue playing it. But on the other hand, it means that other games can be more competitive than Warhammer, in the sense that they can compete with Warhammer because they can make innovations. Bolt Action, again, another Warlords game. That Bolt Action has a really awesome and very unique initiative system that I think works far better than rolling a d6. There is a bag, and you pull from the bag, and if it's your color, you get to go, and if it's your opponent's color, they get to go. But different units can add more little baubles into the bag that you draw from. That's why you bring officers into your army and things like that. There's all sorts of really interesting design. There's Star Wars Legion has a card-based system,
which is very nice.
has a deck of cards that you get to activate certain number of units, but you get to go first, and then your opponent gets to activate even more units depending on what card they play. There's all sorts of really innovative systems in all these different games, but Warhammer 40k is still using systems that were designed in the 80s in some places, and I do think that there needs to be some move on. I think the Games Workshop are probably to some extent aware of this. I think they know that that's the case, but they just want to be able to monetize it properly if they do change anything. I think that we'll see these sorts of experiments in the specialist games, but I don't think 40k will change. Age of Sigmar, maybe, because they've got a lot more scope to play around with Age of Sigmar because it's so young and it has a much younger sort of audience, and I think they feel that they can sell it to younger people, whereas 40k, it has its position in the marketplace and it's full of grognards like myself, and they don't want to alienate anyone.
Von, last question.
I think the interesting thing about the alienation problem is that you see similar dynamics in other, like power creep to sell books or to sell editions is been a constant bane of like every hobby system ever. Even things like White Wolf, which you wouldn't think would be given to it, definitely did, and it eventually caused a problem. It actually caused them to nuke their line and probably kill their company in the long run. But it is interesting that there seems to be a different dynamic with miniatures in specific, where this is a more viable model. And I couldn't explain. Do you have a theory as to why? Because with tabletop gaming, people know you have to reset and rebalance about every 5 to 10 years.
I think that on the one hand, I think that the models are really expensive. So people accumulate these large collections, and they do so under certain sort of assumptions. And I think that because there's so much of a buy-in, that people kind of have a little bit of an element of, I've got mine, I don't really care what happens to your army. I'm sure there's a lot of Space Marines who really don't care what happens to Eldar. But on the other hand, I think it's also the element of competitiveness. So the game is very competitive. And so there's a lot of people who are served by the idea that if they can keep up and there's less opponents who can, they're actually okay with this sort of flavor of the month model because they know that they can buy the next flavor of the month and they can keep up and they'll be able to play that. And again, that goes into the sort of the monetization of wheels that Games Workshop likes to do. They like to monetize people who'll spend lots of money. They want to get you to spend as much as possible. I think that the competitive nature of the game is one way to do that, which is kind of ironic because I don't think it's a very competitive game at all right now. I think that right now there's a huge problem. I think some of the worst competitive games in the game's history are being played at the moment because of these sorts of issues. But I think at its core DNA, I think that's definitely a huge element of it. You mentioned like White Wolf, I suppose they had like the meta plot and things like that they were trying to deal with. And then they nuked the line and created Chronicles of Darkness, I think is what you were. And I think they don't get affected as badly just because it's not a competitive game. At the end of the day, you're sort of, you could be super powerful and you can be like this new strain of vampire, but it doesn't really make like a huge impact on the game. Your storyteller will probably nerf you in some way anyway. Whereas in Warhammer, you could win a tournament and you could feel really good about that because you beat everybody else. And so that gets monetized. That sense that it gets monetized completely. And there's lots of people who will just buy these things because they want to keep up and they want new rules and they want new stuff for their game, which is in a lot of ways something that I completely agree with. I like to see my army get updated. I just don't think necessarily that it should be sold. I think that that's kind of strange. I think that these things should probably just get updated for free. Imagine. Yeah.
Well, in the tabletop miniature utopia of the future, there will be the FAQs and codexes will all be free. The beauty. Well, Discourse, it has been a real pleasure talking with you today. Thank you so much for spending time with us. We do hope you will come back again and talk with us in the future. And we wish you the best with your channel. We will put links down into the doobly-doo at the bottom so people can check out your work and can maybe follow you on Patreon. Do you have anything you want to plug before we leave?
Everything I have is on YouTube, so just check out the links, and I'll see you over there. It's been a real pleasure to hang out with you guys, and yeah, 100%. I'd be more than happy to come back one day.
Awesome. So, guys, remember, like, subscribe, follow Von Vlog, follow This Is Revolution, and Von, anything else you want to plug before we leave?
Nope, not today.
So hopefully next Gaming Materialists will be going into the OSR, and we'll be looking for a guest to talk about the exciting world of roleplay games. And yeah, that's pretty much what we've done for today. So, as we always say on This Is Revolution, we are out.